In the small, quiet town of Maplewood, life moved at a gentle pace. The air was always filled with the scent of pine trees from the surrounding forests, and the sound of birds chirping could be heard almost everywhere you went. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and people left their doors unlocked without worry. But all that changed one fateful night in October 1994, a night no one in Maplewood would ever forget. Emily Carter was just 8 years old when she lived with her grandparents on a cozy little farm outside town. Her parents had passed away in a car accident years earlier, leaving her in the care of her loving grandparents. They were the heart and soul of her world. Her grandfather, a retired carpenter who loved telling stories about his youth, and her grandmother, an expert baker whose apple pies were famous throughout the county. Together, they made sure Emily never felt alone. She spent her days helping them around the house, playing with her favorite doll, and exploring the woods behind their property. Life wasn't perfect, but it was happy. On the evening of October 12, 1994, however, everything changed in an instant. Neighbors reported seeing thick black smoke rising into the sky shortly after dinner time. The sight sent panic through the community as word spread quickly. The Carters' farmhouse was on fire. Dozens of residents rushed to the scene, some grabbing buckets of water while others tried to help extinguish the flames with garden hoses. By the time the fire trucks arrived, though, the house was already engulfed in roaring flames. Firefighters worked tirelessly to control the blaze, but the wooden structure burned so fast that there was little hope of saving anyone inside. As the fire raged on, neighbors gathered nearby, watching in horror as the home they'd visited countless times turned into a pile of ash. Some prayed silently, hoping against hope that Emily and her grandparents had managed to escape. Others whispered nervously among themselves, wondering how such a tragedy could happen. When the flames finally died down hours later, firefighters combed through the wreckage searching for survivors, or at least remains. What they found, or rather, what they didn't find, left everyone baffled. There were no bodies inside the charred ruins. Instead, investigators discovered fragments of bones scattered throughout the debris. At first glance, these seemed like evidence of human remains, but further testing revealed something shocking. The bones belonged to animals, not humans. This discovery only deepened the mystery. Where were Emily and her grandparents? Had they somehow escaped before the fire started? Or had someone taken them away? Sheriff Tom Grayson, a seasoned officer known for his calm demeanor, took charge of the investigation. He had been serving Maplewood for over 2 decades and prided himself on solving every case that came across his desk. But this one felt different. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. Something about the fire didn't add up. For starters, the intensity of the blaze suggested it hadn't been caused by an ordinary accident. It was too sudden, too powerful. Could it have been arson? Rumors began swirling around town almost immediately. Some speculated that Emily's grandparents might have owed money to dangerous people. Others thought perhaps they'd decided to leave town abruptly, faking their deaths to start fresh somewhere else. A few even whispered darker theories that someone had deliberately set the fire to harm the family. Without concrete evidence or witnesses, however, none of these ideas could be proven. For weeks, Sheriff Grayson interviewed neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have information about the Carters. He visited their farm multiple times, examining the scorched earth and sifting through the ashes for clues. But no matter how hard he looked, nothing pointed to a clear explanation. The lack of bodies and the strange nature of the fire haunted him. Deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and her grandparents weren't dead. They were missing. As days turned into weeks, then months, the case grew colder. Life in Maplewood slowly returned to normal, though the memory of the fire lingered like a shadow over the town. People stopped talking about it openly, but privately, they still wondered what had really happened. Children played near the ruins of the farmhouse, daring each other to step closer to the crumbling foundation. Teenagers told ghost stories about Emily wandering the woods at night, looking for her lost family. And yet, despite the whispers and legends, no new leads emerged. Sheriff Grayson refused to give up. Even after retiring years later, he kept a folder dedicated to the case on his desk at home. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs of the farmhouse before the fire, and notes scribbled during interviews. Every now and then, he'd open the folder, staring at the pieces of the puzzle that refused to fit together. He often found himself wondering, was Emily still alive? If so, why hadn't she come forward? And most importantly, who, or what, had caused the fire that destroyed her childhood home? Little did anyone know the answers to these questions wouldn't surface for nearly 2 decades. Until then, the mystery of Emily Carter and her grandparents remained unsolved, buried beneath layers of speculation and doubt. But as history has shown, sometimes the truth takes its own sweet time to reveal itself, and when it does, it can change everything. As the years rolled on, life in Maplewood continued, but the memory of the fire lingered like a faint echo that refused to fade. The once bustling farmhouse was now nothing more than a pile of charred wood and broken bricks, overtaken by weeds and vines. Nature had begun its slow process of reclaiming the land, as if trying to erase the scars left behind by that tragic night. Yet no matter how much time passed, the unanswered questions about Emily Carter and her grandparents remained etched into the minds of those who lived there. For the townsfolk, the story of the Carters evolved from a painful tragedy into something almost mythical. Parents would warn their children not to wander too close to the ruins, spinning tales of ghostly figures seen lurking near the old foundation. Some claimed they heard faint laughter echoing through the woods at dusk, while others swore they spotted a shadowy silhouette standing where the house once stood. These stories became part of local lore, whispered during late-night gatherings or campfires deep in the forest. To many, Emily wasn't just a name anymore. She was a legend, a ghostly presence haunting the edges of their imagination. Despite these eerie rumors, most people eventually moved on with their lives. New families moved into town, bringing fresh energy and new beginnings. Old-timers still remembered the fire, of course, but it became less of a wound and more of a distant scar, a reminder of how fragile life could be. For Sheriff Tom Grayson, however, moving on wasn't so easy. Even after retiring, he couldn't let go of the case. It gnawed at him, like an unsolved crossword puzzle missing one crucial word. He often sat alone in his study, flipping through the worn pages of his investigation folder, searching for connections he might have missed all those years ago. The folder itself had become a kind of shrine to the mystery. Inside were faded newspaper clippings detailing the fire, grainy photographs of the farmhouse before it burned down, and handwritten notes from interviews he'd conducted back in 1994. There were maps of the property, sketches of the layout of the house, and even a list of possible suspects, though none of them had panned out. Sometimes Grayson would stare at the picture of Emily clipped from an old-school newsletter. She was smiling brightly, her hair tied back in pigtails, clutching her beloved doll. That image haunted him. How could such an innocent child vanish without a trace? Grayson's wife, Margaret, tried to encourage him to let it go. "You've done everything you can," she'd say gently, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes we just have to accept that some things will never make sense." But Grayson couldn't bring himself to do that. For him, giving up felt like betraying Emily and her grandparents. He owed it to them, and to himself, to keep looking for answers no matter how long it took. Meanwhile, the Carters' relatives struggled to find closure in their own ways. Emily's Aunt Linda visited the site of the farmhouse every year on the anniversary of the fire. She'd bring flowers and place them carefully near the crumbling chimney, the only part of the structure still standing. Standing there, surrounded by silence, she'd talk quietly to herself, or maybe to Emily, as if hoping her niece could somehow hear her. Linda had always been close to Emily, often taking her shopping or baking cookies together during visits. Losing her felt like losing a piece of herself, and she carried that loss with her every day. Other relatives chose different paths. Some avoided talking about the fire altogether, burying themselves in work or hobbies to distract from the pain. Others clung to the hope that Emily was still alive somewhere, living under a different name or starting a new life far away. They scoured newspapers for stories of foundlings or runaways, convinced that if they looked hard enough, they'd find her. But as the years ticked by, that hope grew dimmer and dimmer. Back in Maplewood, the younger generation barely remembered the fire at all. To them, it was just another spooky story told around Halloween, like urban legends about haunted houses or cursed objects. Kids dared each other to sneak onto the property after dark, giggling nervously as they tiptoed past the rusted gate. Most chickened out before getting too close, spooked by the eerie atmosphere or the creaking trees swaying in the wind. Those brave enough to venture farther often came back pale-faced, swearing they'd seen strange lights flickering in the distance or heard footsteps crunching through the leaves. Even the adults weren't immune to the pull of superstition. Every now and then, someone would claim to have spotted Emily wandering near the ruins. One elderly woman swore she saw a little girl in a white dress standing by the creek late one evening. Another man reported hearing a soft voice calling his name while walking his dog near the woods. Though skeptics dismissed these sightings as tricks of the mind or overactive imaginations, they added fuel to the growing mythology surrounding the case. Despite all this, life in Maplewood carried on. Babies were born, businesses opened and closed, and seasons changed in their predictable rhythm. The fire became a footnote in the town's history, mentioned only in passing during community events or casual conversations. Yet, beneath the surface, it remained a silent thread connecting everyone, a shared memory that bound them together even as they tried to forget. And so, the mystery of Emily Carter and her grandparents slipped further into the past, buried under layers of time and speculation. For 18 long years, it seemed as though the truth would remain forever hidden, swallowed by the same flames that destroyed the farmhouse. But fate has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Little. Did anyone know? The answers they sought were closer than they realized, waiting patiently to resurface in the most unexpected place imaginable. It was a crisp autumn morning in 2012 when Harold Jenkins, the owner of Maplewood's only junkyard, arrived at work to begin his day. The junkyard was a sprawling maze of rusted metal, discarded appliances, and piles of scrap materials that had been dumped there over the years. To most people, it was just a chaotic mess, a graveyard for things no one wanted anymore. But to Harold, it was a treasure trove of forgotten stories. He loved sifting through the debris, imagining the lives connected to each broken chair, dented car door, or cracked picture frame. Little did he know, that morning would lead him to uncover something far more extraordinary than he could have ever imagined. Harold had spent the better part of the morning sorting through a recent delivery of demolition scraps from an old barn on the outskirts of town. The barn had belonged to a property developer who was clearing land for a new housing project. Most of what Harold received was typical junk: bent nails, splintered wood, and chunks of concrete. But as he rummaged deeper into the pile, something caught his eye. Nestled among the rubble was a small, weathered metal box, its surface covered in scratches and dents. At first glance, it looked like any other piece of trash, but something about it made Harold pause. Maybe it was the way the sunlight glinted off the faint engraving on its lid, or perhaps it was the strange weight of it in his hands. Whatever it was, Harold decided to open it. Inside, he found a collection of items that sent a shiver down his spine. There was a singed doll with matted hair and handmade clothes, its face smudged with soot. Next to it lay a tarnished silver locket, its delicate chain tangled and frayed. When Harold pried it open, he discovered a faded photograph inside, a smiling little girl flanked by an older man and woman. Though the image was blurry and discolored, Harold immediately recognized them. His stomach tightened as realization dawned. This was Emily Carter and her grandparents, the very family whose disappearance had haunted Maplewood for nearly 2 decades. But the most startling discovery came when Harold unfolded a brittle notebook tucked into the box. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, some of them crumbling at the edges, but the writing was still legible. It appeared to be a diary, written in a child's uneven handwriting, filled with doodles of flowers, stars, and stick figures. As Harold skimmed the entries, his heart began to race. The words painted a vivid picture of life leading up to the fateful night of the fire. Emily wrote about helping her grandmother bake pies, playing hide-and-seek in the woods, and listening to her grandfather's stories about building houses. But as Harold turned the pages, the tone shifted. She described strange men visiting the house late at night, arguments she overheard between her grandfather and these visitors, and her growing fear. One entry stood out in particular. "Grandma hid me in the attic tonight," she said. "Stay quiet, sweetheart, we'll protect you. I don't know why they're here, but I'm scared." I held my doll really tight and didn't make a sound. By the time Harold finished reading, his hands were trembling. This wasn't just a random find. It was evidence, a tangible link to the mystery that had baffled the town for 18 years. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called the local police department. When Sheriff Tom Grayson heard about the discovery, now long retired but still deeply invested in the case, he rushed to the junkyard faster than anyone expected. Age had slowed him down, but the spark of determination in his eyes hadn't dimmed. As soon as Harold handed him the box, Grayson knew this was the break they'd been waiting for. He carefully examined each item, his mind racing with possibilities. The locket confirmed beyond doubt that the box belonged to Emily. And the diary? It was a goldmine of information, offering insights into the days leading up to the fire. Detective Sarah Mills, who had taken over many of Grayson's old cases after his retirement, joined him at the junkyard. Together, they pored over the contents of the box, piecing together clues. The diary revealed details that aligned with what little they already knew about the Carters' final days. Emily mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the farmhouse and hearing hushed conversations about money and trouble. These entries suggested that someone, or several someones, had been pressuring her grandparents before the fire. But the most chilling revelation came toward the end of the diary. In one entry, Emily described crawling out of a window during the chaos of the fire, clutching her doll and locket. She wrote about running into the woods, terrified and alone, unsure where to go or whom to trust. The last few pages were hurriedly scrawled, almost frantic, and then abruptly stopped. Grayson and Mills exchanged a glance. If the diary was accurate, Emily hadn't perished in the fire as everyone assumed. She had escaped. But where did she go? Why hadn't she come forward? And who, or what, had driven her into hiding? To trace the origins of the metal box, detectives contacted the demolition crew responsible for tearing down the barn. After some digging, they learned that the barn had once been part of a larger property adjacent to the Carters' farm. Records showed that the land had been owned by a man named Victor Hensley, a name that rang a bell for Grayson. Years ago, Hensley had served prison time for arson-related crimes, though his conviction stemmed from incidents unrelated to the Carters. Could he have been involved in the fire? And if so, what role did he play? As news of the discovery spread, excitement rippled through Maplewood. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, there was real hope that the truth might finally come to light. People gathered around coffee shops and grocery store aisles, whispering about the diary and speculating about what it meant. Some believed Emily was still alive, living under a false identity somewhere far away. Others thought she might have fallen victim to whoever set the fire. Either way, the entire town was holding its breath, waiting to see where this unexpected twist would lead. For Grayson, the discovery reignited a fire within him. 18 years of frustration melted away, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. He and Detective Mills vowed to leave no stone unturned in their quest for answers. They started by tracking down Victor Hensley, determined to get to the bottom of his connection to the Carters. Meanwhile, they launched a nationwide search for Emily, using sketches based on descriptions from the diary and appealing to the public for tips. The junkyard, once a place of forgotten odds and ends, had become the epicenter of a story that refused to die. What Harold Jenkins stumbled upon that morning wasn't just a dusty relic. It was a lifeline to the past, a chance to unravel the mystery that had haunted Maplewood for so long. As Grayson and Mills worked tirelessly to follow the trail, one thing became clear. The truth was closer than anyone realized. All they needed to do was keep digging, and this time they weren't going to stop until every question was answered. The discovery of the metal box from the junkyard had ignited a renewed sense of urgency in the investigation. and Sheriff Tom Grayson, along with Detective Sarah Mills, wasted no time diving deeper into the decades-old mystery. The diary written by Emily Carter was not just a heartbreaking account of her final days at the farmhouse. It was also a roadmap leading them toward answers they had been searching for since 1994. With fresh evidence in hand, the two investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle, determined to uncover what really happened that fateful night. Their first step was to dig into the identity of Victor Hensley, whose name had surfaced during their inquiry into the origins of the barn where the metal box was found. Hensley wasn't exactly a stranger to trouble. He had served prison time in the early 2000s for setting fire to several abandoned buildings as part of an insurance fraud scheme. While those crimes occurred years after the Carters' tragedy, his history of arson made him a person of interest. Was it possible he had targeted the Carters' farmhouse too? And if so, why? Grayson and Mills tracked down Hensley's current address, a rundown trailer on the outskirts of a neighboring town. When they arrived, they found him sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette and squinting against the bright sunlight. Hensley was older now, his face lined with age and his once muscular frame diminished by years of hard living. At first, he seemed reluctant to talk, brushing off their questions with vague responses like, "I don't know anything about that fire," or "You're wasting your time here." But as the detectives pressed further, showing him photographs of the Carters and the singed doll from the metal box, something shifted in his demeanor. His eyes darted nervously and he stubbed out his cigarette more forcefully than necessary. Finally, under relentless questioning, Hensley admitted to being involved, but not in the way anyone expected. He confessed that he had set the fire, claiming he believed the house was empty when he torched it. According to him, he'd been hired by loan sharks who were pressuring the Carters over unpaid debts. They wanted to send a message to scare the elderly couple into paying up. Hensley swore he had no idea Emily was inside, or even alive at the time. He claimed he'd done his job quickly and left without checking whether anyone escaped. While Hensley's confession provided some clarity, it also raised new questions. If Emily had survived the fire as her diary suggested, where did she go afterward? Why hadn't she come forward? And what happened to her grandparents? These unanswered pieces gnawed at Grayson and Mills, driving them to dig even deeper. With Hensley's admission pointing toward financial troubles as a motive, the detectives revisited old records related to the Carters' property. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. In the months leading up to the fire, the Carters had fallen behind on mortgage payments, struggling to keep up with mounting bills. Neighbors recalled seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the farmhouse late at night and hearing heated arguments coming from inside. It all pointed to mounting pressure and fear from outside forces threatening the family. But the most compelling clue came from Emily's diary itself. Detectives analyzed every word, piecing together fragments of her story. One entry described how her grandfather argued fiercely with the bad men, insisting they leave his family alone. Another mentioned how her grandmother taught her how to hide in case danger came knocking. These details suggested the Carters knew they were being targeted, but refused to back down. Their bravery, however, may have ultimately sealed their fate. As Grayson and Mills continued their investigation, they turned their attention to finding Emily herself. Using descriptions from the diary, her age, appearance, and mannerisms, they created composite sketches and distributed them nationwide. They reached out to missing persons organizations, social services, and even online communities dedicated to reuniting families. Flyers bearing Emily's likeness appeared in post offices, libraries, and community centers across the country. The message was simple: "Do you know this girl?" At the same time, they launched a public appeal, urging anyone with information to come forward. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting segments about the mysterious disappearance and the recent discovery of the diary. For many viewers, it was the first time they'd heard about Emily Carter's case. Calls poured in from people claiming to have seen her, or someone matching her description, over the years. Some leads were dead ends, while others offered tantalizing glimpses of hope. One caller reported seeing a young woman resembling Emily working at a diner in Oregon shortly after the fire. Another claimed to have met someone named Emma Reed, who fit Emily's profile and spoke vaguely about losing her family in a tragic accident. Each tip brought the team closer to unraveling the truth, though none proved definitive. Until one day, nearly 6 months after the discovery of the metal box, a breakthrough finally came. In a small sheriff's office in Salem, Oregon, a nervous-looking woman walked in and introduced herself as Emma Reed. She explained that she'd seen news reports about the reopened investigation and realized she might be the person everyone was looking for. Her voice trembled as she recounted her story. She was indeed Emily Carter. After fleeing the fire, she wandered aimlessly through the woods until exhaustion overtook her. A kind couple passing by found her huddled beneath a tree, clutching her doll and locket, and took her in. Terrified of whoever had set the fire coming after her, she chose to disappear completely, adopting a new identity and starting fresh, far away from Maplewood. Emma's revelation sent shockwaves through the town. Friends, relatives, and neighbors, who had mourned her loss for nearly 2 decades, were overwhelmed with emotion. Linda, Emily's aunt, wept openly when she received the news, saying, "All these years, I prayed she was still alive. To know she's okay, it's like a miracle." For Grayson, hearing Emily confirm the details of her escape validated everything he'd fought so hard to prove. Though justice for her grandparents remained elusive, knowing Emily had survived gave him a measure of peace. Still, not every question had been answered. What exactly happened to her grandparents? Did they perish in the fire, or were they taken elsewhere before it started? And why had Hensley been so certain the house was empty? These lingering mysteries reminded everyone that while the truth can bring closure, it doesn't always provide all the answers. For Maplewood, Emily's return marked the end of one chapter, but the scars of the past would forever remain etched in the town's collective memory. When Emily Carter, now going by the name Emma Reed, walked into the sheriff's office in Salem, Oregon, it marked a turning point not just for her, but for the entire town of Maplewood. For nearly 2 decades, her disappearance had been a gaping wound in the community, a mystery that refused to heal. Now with her return, there was finally a sense of closure, but also a flood of new questions and emotions. Emma was hesitant at first, visibly uneasy about stepping back into a life she'd worked so hard to leave behind. Her voice trembled as she recounted the night of the fire, describing how she crawled out of a window and ran blindly into the woods, clutching her doll and locket. She spoke of the fear that gripped her, the sound of flames crackling behind her, and the overwhelming loneliness of being separated from the only family she'd ever known. When she reached the part where a kind couple found her and took her in, tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do," she said softly. "I thought whoever started the fire would come after me next." The couple, whose names were later revealed to be Margaret and Richard Lane, had no idea who Emma really was. They simply saw a frightened child in need of help and decided to take her in. At first, they tried to report her as a missing child, contacting local authorities and sharing her description with nearby towns. But when no one came forward to claim her, they began to suspect she might be running from something, or someone. Sensing her fear, they made a difficult decision. They gave her a new identity, enrolling her in school under the name Emma Reed and raising her as their own daughter. Over time, Emma adapted to her new life, burying her past deep inside and focusing on moving forward. For Sheriff Tom Grayson, hearing Emma's story filled him with both relief and sorrow. On one hand, he was overjoyed to learn that she had survived and built a life for herself. On the other hand, the weight of what she and her grandparents had endured was almost too much to bear. He couldn't shake the image of an 8-year-old girl fleeing a burning house, terrified and alone. It was a stark reminder of how cruel the world could be. As word spread that Emily Carter had been found alive, Maplewood erupted in a mix of celebration and reflection. Friends, neighbors, and relatives gathered at the site of the old farmhouse, laying flowers and lighting candles in honor of her return. Linda, Emily's aunt, traveled to Oregon to meet her niece face to face. Their reunion was emotional, filled with tears, hugs, and long overdue apologies. "I'm so sorry we didn't protect you," Linda whispered, holding Emily tightly. "But I'm so glad you're here now." Despite the joy of reuniting with loved ones, Emily struggled to adjust to her sudden fame. Reporters flocked to Salem, eager to interview the woman who had vanished without a trace only to resurface 18 years later. Strangers sent letters and messages expressing sympathy or curiosity about her story. While some of the attention was kind and supportive, it quickly became overwhelming. Emily wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the constant scrutiny made her feel exposed and vulnerable. She retreated into herself, relying on the same resilience that had helped her survive all those years ago. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together the events surrounding the fire. Victor Hensley's confession provided crucial insight, confirming that the blaze had been deliberately set. However, his claim that he believed the house was empty raised doubts about his full involvement. Had someone else tipped him off? Was there another person or group working behind the scenes? These unanswered questions lingered like shadows, refusing to dissipate even in the light of Emily's return. One particularly haunting detail emerged during further analysis of the diary. In her final entries, Emily wrote about seeing her grandparents arguing with the bad men who visited their home late at night. She described overhearing snippets of conversation, including threats and demands for money. This suggested that her grandparents may have been targeted specifically, not just victims of random violence but pawns in a larger scheme. Unfortunately, without concrete evidence or witnesses, determining exactly what happened to them proved impossible. Were they killed before the fire started? Or did they perish in the flames, unable to escape? The truth remained buried beneath layers of ash and time. In the months that followed, Emily slowly began rebuilding connections with her past. She visited Maplewood several times, walking through the woods where she used to play and standing quietly near the ruins of the farmhouse. Each trip brought a mix of pain and healing, forcing her to confront memories she'd spent years trying to forget. Yet, despite the heartache, she felt a strange sense of peace. Returning to the place where her childhood ended allowed her to reclaim a piece of herself, to acknowledge the strength it took to survive and rebuild. The town of Maplewood embraced her homecoming, organizing events to welcome her back and celebrate her resilience. Children who had grown up hearing ghost stories about Emily now met her in person, marveling at the fact that she was real. Older residents shared their own memories of her grandparents, painting a picture of a loving family torn apart by tragedy. For the first time in years, the air around Maplewood felt lighter, as if the weight of uncertainty had finally lifted. Still, not everything could be resolved. Some wounds ran too deep to fully heal. Emily's grandparents were gone, their fate forever shrouded in mystery. Victor Hensley faced charges for arson but avoided conviction for murder due to lack of evidence. And though Emily had returned, the scars of her ordeal would stay with her for the rest of her life. She carried them quietly, like invisible threads, woven into the fabric of her being. In the end, Emily's story served as a powerful reminder of the human spirit's capacity to endure. Despite unimaginable loss and fear, she had found a way to survive, and eventually thrive. Her journey inspired those around her, offering hope to others who had faced darkness and emerged on the other side. Though the fire had taken so much, from her, it hadn't taken her will to live, to love, and to keep moving forward. As the years passed, Maplewood transformed once again. The ruins of the farmhouse were cleared away, replaced by a small memorial garden dedicated to Emily and her grandparents. A plaque bore the inscription, "In memory of those lost and found, may their courage guide us all." Visitors often stopped by to pay their respects, leaving flowers, notes, or trinkets as tokens of remembrance. For Emily, the garden became a place of solace, a quiet corner where she could sit and reflect. Sometimes she brought her own daughter, born years after her return, to share stories of the grandparents she never got to meet. Other times she simply sat alone, listening to the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds overhead. In those moments, surrounded by nature's beauty, she felt closest to the family she'd lost, and to the little girl she used to be. The fire that destroyed the Carters' home had left an indelible mark on Maplewood, shaping its history and its people in ways no one could have predicted. But out of the ashes rose a story of survival, resilience, and redemption, a testament to the enduring power of hope, even in the face of unimaginable loss. And though some mysteries would always remain unsolved, Emily's return reminded everyone that sometimes the truth finds its way back to us when we least expect it.